Hi there, y'all. I'm Grant. In this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I use Neo4j with Game of Thrones data. That's actually a Song of Ice and Fire data. It's not really having to do with the show, but with the books. I've got a project that I've been working on for started in 2014 when I decided that I was going to take up Python. Around the same time, I was discovering Neo4j. I've had a long interest in graph theory, network theory, that type of thing, and Neo4j scratched an itch that I needed, and it was natural to combine the two. I used this, well, there's a lot of stuff in A Song of Ice and Fire. It's a big thing. There's a lot of, I don't know, there's a lot of different aspects to it, right? And so what I wanted to do was build something like a knowledge graph. Not like, okay, so, it's more about, it's not that I have a specific question in mind, a specific problem in mind. It's that I want to be able to, it's like, how can I represent, how can I model a story, a history, a fake, a fictional history world and all of the stuff that encompasses that in a single model that could be traversed, essentially. And so that's a knowledge graph. You know, here's all of the things that make up the story and how they connect to each other, right? So it's more of a, less of a, I'm trying to count up the number of times that, so and so says something or other. It's that I want to have the facility to ask those questions, right? I think of myself more as a data engineer than a data scientist, if you like to use the modern nomenclature. And what I'm after is something that data scientists can use. And I've seen, a number of people doing different things, but nobody seems to be doing this particular approach. And well, what it's really about for me is, at least in this context here, is that this is about the workflow. This isn't about the result. This is about how do I do what I'm doing? How do I get from point A to point B? And, because this sort of thing can be applied to anything. This is just, I just chose this because I, happen to like the series. And there's enough interest because of the television show that, that this might be something. I mean, there's going to be college courses taught on this thing later on, and when that happens, hey, it'd be nice to have like a modern style database where you can pull stuff out of. So that's kind of where this is all coming from. This is something I work on in my spare time. I have since, April or so of 2014 when I like conceived of this, and started I had actually thought of something like this before that, but long about 2014 was when I found the tools necessary to actually start doing things with it. So the project is called. Ooh, I'll do this. The GRROM. George R. Object model. Ha ha ha. Yeah, it's a computer science joke. So, the idea is that we're going to take some sources, some individual sources, put them through whatever complexity of transformation are needed, and put these things into the Neo4j database. The bits that I have to start with, this is, you know what, before I do that, let's take a look at the actual result, or a version of the result. This is, part of the workflow is that I'm remaking this constantly. It's not like a carefully curated database where I've, done every node by hand. It's, I'm shoving stuff into it, processing it, and ending up with a database. So here I'm logged into what it is right now, or what it is the last time I built it on this computer, because I have actually a more modern version of this than I've been working on, or I've been on a different system. But this one works. So I've got we've got well, let's start out like this. We've got the canon, and then the pieces of the canon, right? The history books, the Tales of Dunk and Egg, Song of Ice and Fire. If we were to say what's in a Song of Ice and Fire, right? So we've got Game of Thrones, Clash of Kings, yada yada. So this is a little representation of the book series itself. Just kind of at a top level. What is there, right? Canon could be thought of maybe as the entire, that's the omega node, the alpha node, I suppose. So if I want to take Game of Thrones, then we're looking at chapters in here, right? Here's the prologue. What's in the prologue? Will. Will was the narrator, the POV of the prologue. Will has a bunch of stuff. Because he was a POV, he said all of these things. These are individual sentences, or sentence fragments is what I think of them as. Let's look at this. Sir Waymar Royce came next, his great black destrier snorting impatiently, right? There's all of this sort of data about each little line and whatnot, right? Number of words is what it's showing in there, but that doesn't really matter. So Will's a human. Who else is a human? A lot of people are humans. And you can see we're tying to these are POVs, right? Look at that. I pulled it out, and there's the ones that are POVs: John, Ned, Danny, Arya. So let's take Eddard Stark as a definitely one who's got a lot of data attached to him. Let's see. Okay, so he, being a POV, also has sentences that he has said, and this is only representing a few chapters right now, because this, if this were everything, then good golly, it's, using the limits, but, so Stark is a family. What are the other things that it's attached to? Here are the other families that are vassals of the Starks, right? Stark itself is a vassal of the crown. Let's see. Yes, so Howland Reed, who was a human. House Reed, vassal of Stark, vassal of the crown. Who are the other vassals of the crown? The Tyrells, the Greyjoys, the Targaryens. See, it's all time periods are kind of together, right? The actual where things are, what things are when, right? The fact that Targaryen, the crown is sort of this abstract concept, right? That it may be Baratheon, it may be Targaryen, it may be whatever. And see, here's the Tullys, vassals of the crown, right? And so you're looking at them in terms of, like, where are, well, there's lots of different things. There's lots of different aspects of it. So, let's see. You can sort of see where this is going. Anyway, there's other. Let's see. What does Drogo do? Nope, nothing else on Drogo. So, anyway, it's sentences that were said by people and houses that relate to each other, that are part of the books, that are part of the canon, that are part of, and this isn't even all of it. Let's see when I can see how I can break into the timeline. Um, there's locations. Here, let's do another one. Where's some locations? Here's Westeros, Planetos, Essos, which I guess should be over there. And Westeros is going to be over there if we're going to be doofuses about it. And all of that is within the cosmos, which is, which also contains things not on Planetos, like the moon and the comet and things like that, right? So if we need to make a reference to the comet, then we would, link it to this thing, right? So here's the north. And I think locations is actually right now is on its own. I haven't tied that into some other stuff yet, but ultimately locations would be tied into the chapters that took place in those locations and the words that referenced those locations and stuff like that. So that's that, and then one more. Let's look at the calendar for the conquest, after the conquest. Oh, you know what? That's not the one that I wanted to look at. I wanted to look at this time epochs. All right, I have coined the phrase, or coined the word hysteros, to kind of go along with the tongue-in-cheek way of referring to stuff like this, as the, hysteros is everything that's happened, right? And so, you have the Dawn Age and all the great empire, sort of each epoch is its own thing, right? The Reign of Blood, there's the Bloodstone Emperor, there's the last one, right before the Long Night, and so moving into the Age of Heroes, then the Long Night, and then post Long Night, which is like where we're getting into the Empires of Geese and the, like all of the pre-Andal stuff in Essos. So the entire thrust of history is here, and because this is not some SQL database that is that has to have hard references for everything or to account for everything, I can just put what is here. In the Dawn Age, we know very little about actual dates, but when we look at the Iron Throne, for example, we know lots of things. We know that there are two dynasties, and exactly when it started, right? So within the Targaryen dynasty, there are all of these things, right? Look, it ends in 230 and 283, and then there's the Baratheon dynasty. And following the reign of Aerys II, you had Robert, Joffrey, Tommen. And you can see when these things happened, right? 1 AC, all of the Targaryens, to Aerys, and then 283. So this is how the timeline works, essentially, is that you have this hierarchical view of history. And each one of them can get as complex as it needs to, and contain whatever is necessary. And there's Tommen starting in 300. And Joffrey only ruling within a single year, beginning and ending in the same year. Right. So Robert begins and ends. So 283 is part of AC. It follows 284. Before that is 282, 284, 285. So I can trace these years that follow each other, right? So all of these things, when queried for whatever, can provide lots of information. And when everything's tied together, then that's what we're after. That's a knowledge graph. So, where does all of this come from? This comes from primarily a couple of things. Okay, so my general workflow involves, because I'm using Python, and not just going in and doing stuff in Cypher, or even in making, you know, sort of saved Cypher queries. I had done that for a while. That was where I had started with it. Was I had written stuff straight from Cypher, using CSV downloads or whatever, load CSV, that type of thing. And ultimately, I've decided that this is complex enough, and I'm doing enough different types of things with it that it was appropriate to use Python to sort of drive the thing, and that that Py to Neo is the way to actually interact with it. And so I'm using that's how I go. I've summarized the actual data itself into sort of this middle thing, which is this. I have a Google spreadsheet that I access, and again with Python, I'm using GSpread, which is something that allows you to get into Google spreadsheets and treat them in the same way that you might open PyXL or something else that breaks into Excel files. So I can break into my repository of data where I can, make it however I need it to be. See, this is characters, and this is a little list of species, right? And when so I can tie all of these things together, and do different pieces in different times, and each sheet just needs to be what it is. Here's a list of houses and things that are sort of germane to the houses. And then when I want to refer to that house, I can just, I've got to follow the rules because this is sort of a relational database in the sense that this house, Stark right here, in this character, this noble family name is referring to that same Stark, right? So when I process this sheet, I can pull in each one of them separately, and find that that they can interact with each other. I can validate them. I can say, hey, this thing isn't on this other list, and I do. That's the game, right? How do you take all of these individual things and tie them together as we go? So real quick, I'm going to go through the different sheets that are on here and kind of what they represent. This graph layout is sort of a list of some of these are things that already exist here. Some of these are just sort of my thought of what needs to be on there. Like what are the different sections of nodes, right? A timeline or a calendar, which you saw on the other one. Events, which would be it would be causality, right? Like what are the actual literal things that happened in a sense of like, so-and-so killed such and such, right? And that would be an event, right? It wouldn't be, that could be tied to a place in the book, that could be tied to, who the people that were involved, etc. Somebody being born would be the same thing, right? An event, not, not an actual, like a, cause and effect type of things. But, so, and then the text itself, which is the canon all the way down to those sentence fragments that you saw, location hierarchy, which we were looking at, geology and metallurgy and flora and animal types, and that type of thing. So like a kind of a gazetteer of what is exactly in the world, right? And that would extend to, specific animals, right? So if you've got a dire wolf, that's different than Nymeria, right? Like Nymeria is a subset of direwolf, which is a subset of mammals, etc. So all of those things need to be represented in one way or another. And then individual people, the titles that they might hold, which is its own little hierarchy, right? Are you a maester? Are you an archmaester? Well, anybody who was an archmaester was just a maester at one time. So in order to fully represent someone like Pycelle, you have to have them tied to multiple things, right? He's maester, archmaester, grand maester, and all of the other things that he is. Littlefinger would get very complicated, I think, with that too. And then populations is something I thought of, right? How do we represent a city, right? How do we represent the like Flea Bottom? How many people are in Flea Bottom? How do you, like when you have, when you have Cersei Lannister on the one hand, is a single person, and we can track that one single person, but the mob that like during the bread riots or something, what happens, how do you represent the number of people that were involved in the bread riots? So that's populations, and so it may be individual groups of people, it may be something that is like literally the population of Flea Bottom or something, as opposed to some other neighborhood in King's Landing. And then following along with that, occupations, like what are the actual jobs? You've got to tie somebody to Gendry as a blacksmith. We need to say there's a blacksmith job for Gendry to have, right? So all of those different things that would come from that. The houses themselves, the nobility structure, which that's we were looking at that. Everyone's beholden ultimately to the crown and vassals of each other. Houses may be, some houses are extinct, etc. And then there are organizations kind of going along with that. The Faceless Men is not a house, but it's an organization, the Dead of the Iron Bank and things like that. The Dosh Kalin and for the Dothraki, etc. And then there are governments, which may be of multiple types and maybe interact with each other in different ways, and religions, which are another whole subset of thing. The magic hierarchy itself, what are the different types of magic and who can do what, right? The mythical structure itself, what are the different myths and prophecies, etc. Those are their own references, aren't they, right? Because if you have, some prophecy that Daenerys was paying attention to, well, there are different elements that that tie into each one, right? I mean, we can look at the House of the Undying and say that there are many. We know what a lot of those things are, right? The vision of Rhaegar and Elia is, those are specific references, but that is to a myth/prophecy, right? And then the myths, those are sort of actually separate things. Myths and prophecies are not the same thing, but the abstract sort of speculations that may be the broader. There are speculations, in-world speculations that people have. There are, a good example might be what does, how the notion of what happened to Lyanna, right? Ned has some point of view that he knows. Robert thinks something completely different. So how do you express the idea that Lyanna was kidnapped versus the idea that, versus Ned's lie? So that's an interesting problem to solve, which I have not solved yet. Then there are items and specific items. There are Valyrian swords, and there's ice, right? So there are regular swords, and there's something like Longclaw, which is two different swords. Ice became three different swords ultimately, but say Longclaw, right? There was the before the pommel was changed and after the pommel was changed. Those things have to be taken into account. Specific items, types of food, how many people have eaten a blood orange? Where were they? That type of thing. And then physical dimensions of things, which is how do we represent how tall the wall is? How do we represent distances between areas? Right. This is going to play into the geography, the location hierarchy. So those are the pieces. Real quickly, this is characters. This data actually did not come from the book. There's a fellow who had done a bunch, and named Calvin, who had done a bunch of work on this several years ago, and he put together this really amazing Excel sheet that was tracking where people were mentioned as you went through the book. Now Calvin doesn't seem to be working on his data anymore, but he and I had communicated back then, and I'm sort of continuing along with what he's got and organizing it in such a way that it can be used like this. So I have quite a bit of data about who they are and some other metadata about them. But the real great thing is this pretty accurate, well, highly accurate. I'm not exactly sure about the accuracy, but he worked on it enough that I believe that it is highly accurate. That we got each person and whether they were a POV, whether they talked, whether they appeared, or whether they only referred to, right? Garrett, for example, was in chapters 1, 2, and 3 of A Game of Thrones, right? He talked in the first one. He appeared in the second one when he was, being beheaded. And then he was referred to in the third one, which I think was Cat, when Ned was talking about him. So that's sort of how those things go. That's a really interesting piece of data to have. I've been pulling this in sort of by chapter, and so this only goes down to A Game of Thrones 35 at this point. And that's 261 characters so far, that have references, that have been at least referenced in 35 chapters. So, yeah. There's a lot of data. So this is a start of the species, right? I've got the species, what type they are. A human is an animal, a giant is an animal, a children of the forest is also an animal. They're sentient, as opposed to a direwolf, which is an animal, which is a beast, right? Or a viper, which is an animal, which is a reptile, or a manticore, which is an animal, which is an insect. And then we've got plants and animals. So this is just a bare start. This is so that I could have something there, and so that I could refer to people as humans or direwolves, essentially, because in the characters, individual animals, there's Grey Wind right there, right? Here are the direwolves, right? And then we also have to account for the others, right? How do you account for them? What are they even, right? Are they, should they count as human? Probably not, etc. So, and then the houses, which are tied to the characters. Again, kind of accounting for everyone that has been there so far. Where are there multiple phrases in here? Of course there are. Ultimately, this is going to be a piece of the database that is, highly correlated with, with this. This noble family name must match this. So this is something that where validation is happening, that type of thing. Okay, so the timeline, this is where all of those things were coming from. I can get specific years or not, and there is a sort of a hierarchy to it where I have a thing that is where we say what it is and what its parent is, right? All of these individual reigns are part of the Targaryen dynasty. The Targaryen dynasty is part of the Iron Throne era, right? The Iron Throne era is an epoch of Hysteros itself. And so I can get arbitrarily specific with all of this in that way. The locations, we have a similar hierarchy that has an interesting wrinkle in that it's not linear in the way that the timeline ultimately is. We can get more and more granular with the timeline, and it's still going to be just one thing per, right? But within, say, okay, so I was looking at it like this. So we've got something that's Winterfell, right? There's the Winterfell Dominion, which is everything that is like the Winterfell area, right? And that's in the north. And that would be separate from something like the Last Hearth Dominion, which is the Umberland or the Dreadfort Dominion. So within Winterfell Dominion, there's Winterfell Town and Winterfell Castle, which are two different places. Within the Winterfell Castle, right, you might have different substructures that could go arbitrarily deep, right? There's the Great Hall, etc. Okay, so there's the Great Hall. Then there's within the Great Hall, there's above the salt and below the salt, right? And then above the salt, there is the specific table that is the Stark's, the main table, and at that table is Bran's seat, right? So you can get very, very specific, right, and say that you could model a dinner party, when they were, when they were the first night when they were entertaining the Lannisters, you could have, you could literally make a seating chart in this way. The events, that would be an event, right? Dinner with the Lannisters. And that might be a place where, where that sort of data is appropriate. I haven't even started those. Okay, so here's the real meat of the thing, and this is the real. This is where this is the big, the big stuff. Chapter by chapter, every chapter has one of these sheets, and this is what I built at first. I wanted a way of having sentence by sentence metadata, and not word by word, because that's too broad. But you can say, what I did is I took the raw text and put it through a process that allowed, that broke it up into, into the chapter hierarchy and stuff, with a bit of metadata. I'll show you actually what I did there. Okay, so in the raw data, this, for example, is a Game of Thrones, right? So what I did is I had this text version of it. I went through and I added lines at the beginning of each chapter, and then said what's the title of this chapter and who was the POV. And with that, this was just a text file that I had found. And so it's all there. And other than that, the only things that I've done has been cleanup. I was had individually changed a lot of like Unicode characters to ANSI and stuff, so it's easier to deal with and that type of thing. I had experimented briefly with literally like cutting apart the lines, which you can see I did that here in the prologue, but realized that that's not necessary. There's just text processing I can do. Come on, this is all I was using natural language processing stuff to get from this raw thing to this sort of structural thing. And so each one of these fragments is either a sentence or a fragment of a sentence, depending on whether there was speaking, right? So this is all stuff that is sentences that Bran is thinking as his POV, and then when we get down here to this line, Eddard is saying this sentence out loud to Garrett, right? And so all this indexing and the sentences themselves, and whether or not I know that this is spoken dialogue or what I'm thinking of as expository text, is preset. Furthermore, there are pieces that I had gotten from some other sources that had put dates on the chapters, and so I can put in what was there, and I know what the POV is and stuff like that. And so what I was adding myself, or what I have added myself very slowly, because this is tedious work, but it's essentially I'm coding metadata. So I can say who's the speaker for each thing that is spoken, who's the speaker, who's it speaking to. For each line that is not spoken, is it something expository, like saying what has happened, or is it something that Bran, one of the horses reared and had to be restrained to keep from bolting? That is something that happened. That's expository. Bran could not take his eyes off the blood. That's kind of internal. That's more about Bran and what Bran is thinking. So those, are broken into these categories. And I've sort of got it set up so that I can, this isn't even all filled in with those, right? You see all these places where it's orange. That's because that is still needed. So, and the other thing that I've done is that I've broken it up into scenes, right? Bran and his brothers witness Garrett's execution by Ned, and then afterwards, Bran listens to what his brothers have to say about the execution, which is a different scene, right? There's the whole beheading scene, and then there's the scene afterwards where Bran is talking to his brothers about it. So that's sort of how these are broken up. And those are just more divisions, right? As the book goes, it will be fragments within scene, within chapter, within book, within canon, or within, yeah, as it goes up like that. So also tracking who is there and who where they are, but who is there, and as they enter or leave the scene, that those things can be tracked, right? If there's like I think of it like a bubble. There's a bubble around the POV that as people enter or leave that bubble, they would be entering or leaving the scene. That way you can have these long timelines of that. And then this stuff over here, I just this is just some spreadsheet stuff where I was saying how can we flag easily when you're looking in these sheets, because these sheets are pretty cool. Can you search basically, right? If I want to look for the word cold in Brand's first chapter, right? The yellow, that's the places where the word cold is mentioned. There's direwolf, sword, blood. Just those are just, and these can be changed, right? If I wanted to say hot, there's hot right there. So anyway, these are the sheets, and there's one of these for each chapter. I've got in this sheet, or in this document, I've got up through Game of Thrones 14, which is Tyrion 2. So I've got, counting the prologue, I've got 15 chapters represented here in this method. So next is the actual. Okay. So one more thing I wanted to. So that's the raw data. I have all I have all 5 books and the 3 Duncan Egg things. And then there is separately some wiki data, which is just pulled down. This is just scraped out of the scraped it once out of the Song of Ice and Fire wiki. There are 2 pieces to it, which are real simple. I'm just using Beautiful Soup to grab the data and pulling out things. In this case, I'm getting the list of characters. That's it. Just an index, one page of index. And then to parse that out, I've got this little bit here, which is taking that output that I saved and pulling out just the names of the characters. And so those are tied back to this here. So I've got, sort of my internal reference, Robb Stark, the Wiki of Ice and Fire reference, so that I can link to it, which is, generally the same thing. Wiki of Ice and Fire is not a perfect data source. It's darn close, but I can curate it in this way and have just the things that I need without having to rely on a data source that changes often, and could potentially be unreliable because of that. So that's the wiki data. Also in my little the thing here, that's admin. That's just the thing so that OAuth works, so that I can break into it. And then the GRROM, this is the Neo4j store itself. And then there is what we're really looking at here, which is the actual thing that's reading that sheet and entering stuff in the graph. So to go through this, I'm using Python 2.7 clearly because I'm importing from future import print function. I'm pulling in from Py to Neo. This is the previous version of Py to Neo. I'm importing graph node and relationship, gspread, which is the thing that breaks into the Google Sheet, OAuth, which allows me to do that, and then counter and JSON and sys. So my basic structure, I have my run at the bottom. I'm running main. So within main, I'm connecting to the sheet, I'm grabbing that wiki data, I'm connecting to the graph. This little bugger here is because, okay, so when interacting with Neo4j in a when interacting with Neo4j with with Python Neo, I found that I would get errors if I was trying to add a constraint to something. Because the idea is when you've got a Python file like this, you want to be able to run it over and over again, right? I want to be able to. In fact, I'm going to do this. Let's go here and go back here. Match, match, and attach, delete, and goodbye. We have an empty database now. Match in, no rows, nothing. Okay, so I'm going to recreate it from scratch. I want to be able to do that as many times as I need to. However, that data in that database, character is already a node type, right? Though I've erased all of the actual nodes, character is still in there, right? And so, at least this may have been altered recently, but at least traditionally in Neo4j, if you try to put a constraint on something that already exists, it will give you an error and say, hey, that thing already exists. And so what I did is I built a little thing that just puts it into a try, and if it doesn't work, it's already there. So we constrain each one of the things. So each character, I want there to only be one, right? The location, they have to be unique, only one version of each house. And this is so we don't end up, so I can run this 100 times and not end up with 2 Ned Starks. Next is the one place in here where I'm actually just using Cypher. You can see this is a bit of a different version. But what I did is this is putting together the actual little corpus part, right? And so all of the books themselves are in there. So I create the block and I run it. Pretty easy, just using Cypher. Then I'm pulling out the worksheets from that from the Google spreadsheet, and then this little series here is going through each one of those sheets that has a specific way of being, each sheet is processed in its own way, right? The locations are not done the same way as the timeline, etc. So I'm building one big object called info, which is going to include all of the stuff that I find from all of those things. And so I'll end up with, with one big complex object that essentially holds my sheet in a way that I can refer to it Pythonically. And then we've got a couple of housekeeping nodes, which I'm adding, just for, because I need, like, the need, right? If I need something, then that needs to be its own thing, but that is not actually part of the sheet, right? That's almost like the null. So just putting that in there manually. And then looking back through the list of sheets to pull out the ones that are chapters, because these other sheets are sort of fixed. There's only one version of chars, but I don't want to have to list out all of the actual chapters. And so I say, give me the whole list, take out the things that I know of, what's left is all chapters. And then with that chapter list, I can go through and do one more of these processes, but process the chapter for each chapter. And then just a little thing to print out the nodes, because it's no good to put things into Neo4j if you can't pull things out of Neo4j. This is my sort of simplified way of saying, I've got stuff in here, show me what I just put in there in a very simplified way, just dump it out to a text file. And I know from that I can get more complex if I need to. So for the actual any data analysis that goes on, that's it. So that's all there is. That's all there is to it. We make sources, and constrain the thing, a little bit of actual, straight interaction, and then process these things, and that's it. So to go through how here's characters, for instance, right? We're going to just grab the matrix out of the sheet. Characters, let's look at that and jump back and forth there and do this one as an example, because they're all essentially the same. But looking at the characters, right? So this is a matrix of information. That's, and every one of them is just every one of them, because it's a spreadsheet, is just a matrix of information. So pulling those out, we grab the fields so that I know what they are. I can get the key field, validate that it's unique, right? And dump out if we find, if it's not. We can validate the parents versus the list of keys, right? So this father, mother, sire, and dam, for instance, Jon Snow has a father that is different than his sire, right? Sire and dam would be who are your birth parents, father and mother would be who do you think are your father and mother. And so, John, for example, he thinks his father is Eddard Stark. He doesn't know who his mother is. No one knows who his mother is because she doesn't actually exist. He was sired by Rhaegar Targaryen, and he was mothered by Lyanna Stark. Spoiler alert. So that's those. These fields are validated against these fields, such that if I had mistyped Eddard Stark as with a father in one of these things, it would alert me and say, hey, there's a guy in here who's not in here. That's what that's doing. So validation of whatever, right? The other sheets have different validations, but of that type, right? And so then we just loop through this thing and pull out. I'm going to have different lists of things that get pulled out of this, the characters themselves. I want a list of the houses, right? I'm going to get a list of the bastard names that are mentioned, right? Because this is where I can tell those. I don't have to tell it ahead of time that Snow is a bastard name. I can put it on this list and say his bastard name is Jon Snow, and then just count them up this way, compiling my lists as I go. The titles that they might hold, the species that they are, right? Which is going to houses and species are both going to match up with other sheets, right? Anyway, I can go through and I can validate, I can add additional validations for those, and I've got things like that in here in different places. So then we go through the rows. We pull out, I'm dumping all of the just easy access names to each one of those, to each one of the things. First ref is you. Let's see. I actually just had added the gender in here, so we'll do that. Born, died, after gender. Let's see, row 15 is gender. Gender is row 15, or is column 15 rather. So I'm adding the character nodes with the attributes that are not themselves going to be other nodes. So there are some things in here that, his name, right? They're like the full name. Their diminutive, their alias, things like that. Catelyn Stark is sometimes called Cat. That's a diminutive. That doesn't itself need to be another name. That is a property of Cat. Old Nan is the alias of Nan. That is a property of that. So their name, their first name, their diminutive, and then that. So the family name is a different thing. That is something that they can share, not unique to the person. So that's treated a little different. If I'm looking at if I have a house, then check that it's there. So here's really where we're putting in nodes. This is the way, the methodology for pushing in nodes, right? I'm going to have, and you can see that I've got a placeholder is a node. It's a character of type. and then the name is the name of the character. And then I'm going to push that node into the GRROM, into the reference to the Neo4j database, right? So I'm going to merge that in. Then I'm going to have add properties to this thing. Sometimes conditionally, right? The first name is always there. The diminutive might be there. The alias might be there. And they have a first reference, which is always there. And so then I can add properties and push it, and now this node is updated. And at the same time, I'm dumping it onto my sort of internal list to say that I've done that. Same thing with the house, same thing with the bastard names, same thing with the titles, and same thing with the species. And in that way, I have accounted for all of this data. I'm not going to add the gender in now, but that's how those go. And then again, we've got a complex way of looking at this, right? If I were just doing this in bare cipher, it would be very like, I figured out ways of doing that using the conditional logic and stuff, or the roundabout conditional logic that was there a while back. And I was able to make a lot of things work, ultimately realizing that it's so much easier to do it like this in Python because I can just make regular logic and do things in stages and stuff, and have it all just kind of be there. So this the parents, which have to sort of feed back into this list itself, is Eddard Stark on this list itself, right? So I've compiled this list. Now I can go back through it again and look at this, comparing it to the list that I just compiled. So I couldn't do that on the first round through. I couldn't do that on the first round, for instance, because Catelyn Stark is mentioned as a mother of Bran Stark before she's actually showing up in this list, because this list is based on their appearance and appearance mentions in the book. So that's why, but when that sort of thing happens, because this is just Python, that's no big deal. I can compile the list and then run back through it and compare it to that list. Again, if the father's there, we take care of the father. If the mother's there, we take care of the mother, etc. And then, having done all of this, look at this. So we're finding the character, right? Because we're not making new nodes here, right? We've already made the nodes of all the characters the first time through. So now we say, find that character that is mentioned in this, and then if the father is there, if Eddard Stark is here, then we're going to find the character, or we're going to have this character related to this character in that way. Make a relationship where we're going from the character we're talking about, which is Bran in this case, to the P node, which is find the name of the father, right? So this, father, that. There's a slightly more modern version of this that I've made with the newer version of Python Neo, where this changes, where the nature of this changes, but that's okay. So yeah, and then each of the others has their own thing. I'm processing the house and all the information, the species, the locations. Characters was the most the most complex of these so far, because the others are mostly hierarchies. But you can see within the timeline, I have to make several references or rounds through it for kind of the same reasons. The events is just sort of a placeholder, and the individual chapters, right? Same sort of pattern, right? Grab the entire sheet. I make references to things that that I care about, and make nodes, make relationships, run through it as many times as necessary. And just add what needs to be added. I'm still, I'm not even anywhere close to, and then this is just the little, constrain the node type, which we looked at before. The actual make the relationship, this is now obsolete because we do it in a different way. parsers for saying within the within this is saying that a character has parse a character move, right? I'm Bran Stark is present, Eddard Stark is present, Jon Snow is present. Let me find a better one. A lot of this stuff isn't filled out. I'm not going to worry about that. Anyway, if Bran is present, that can say that as we tie it along the timeline of sentence by sentence, we can say Bran enters, Bran exits, Bran, or somebody is in the distance, somebody is passing by, you know, somebody is already, or if somebody is already present, if it's you know, if the scene starts in C2 or whatever. And then references, again, we want to be able to reference and say that, you know, that, for instance here, the wildlings were cruel men, she said, slavers and slayers and thieves, right? That's not, if you look at that sentence in, you know, in isolation, who is she, right? There's a reference, that's Old Nan, right? And so that's what this is, parsing references, parsing a reference to Old Nan. There's, you know, this is a giant feedback loop essentially, right? Like, you know, adding things in, verifying that they match up with all the other things. So that's all of that. And last little thing here is to run it. To say, we had started out with an empty Neo4j database. It went and found all these different worksheets. It's processing through the locations, or I already did rather. So it's running through each one of those functions in turn. Oops. So what was it on next? It was on, okay, so it did the timeline, right, and did all of it, and just added all of these things in. We could probably, yeah. So there's the timeline showing up. And it's neat how you can do this sort of in, you know, it's even still processing, but it's already there. Running through those other sheets quickly because there wasn't much to them. All those characters are in. Locations. The corpus itself. The calendar. Some species. Titles. High Septon's the only one that's in there. I already did locations. Epochs, chapters. And see, let's process the prologue. From A Game of Thrones, which is followed by A Clash of Kings. As part of A Song of Ice and Fire, preceded by The Mystery Knight. Will said a bunch of things. Narrated by, he's a human. There's a bunch of other humans. Here's William Derry. William Derry is part of House Derry. Raymond Derry was another of those. Here's House Baratheon. And it's got all of its vassals. Here's Selmy, of whom Barristan is a member, or a scion. And the Crown. The Danes are vassals of the Martells. Here's little Ned Dane. And, oh yeah, he's a human. That's what's going on there. So you can see that these chapters are processing through. And it's pretty quick, right? I mean, for all that it's doing, there's there's not, that's like you can see most of this is already Edric Storm, Maya Stone, Brendan Rivers, Blood Raven, and Martin Rivers. Pike, there's Cotter Pike, Gendry Waters, Jon Snow. You can see I don't even have Ramsay in here yet because I hadn't gotten to that far. But that's it. So there's no need to let that continue, or I mean, I'm going to let that continue, but there's no need to sit here and wait for it because this is kind of all other things. So I know this is a kind of unconventional thing, maybe. This is definitely like usually when I see these sorts of things, it's some specific data science thing, and I'm showing, that this node has a lot more graph theory stuff about it. In my case, I'm looking more at organization than I am at results, and I think that the one will follow the other. So that's it. I'm going to go ahead and say that this is my overview of this project, and hope you enjoyed it.